Hello, Personal Health and Wellness. Kendall here. I wanted to talk about Chapter 3, and before I start talking about content from Chapter 3, I'm reminded of a saying that says that if you do the things to stay healthy, you'll probably end up in an orthopedic doctor's office. If you don't do the things to stay healthy, you'll probably end up in a cardiologist doctor's office. So what I want to do is I want to kind of go from that and say that there's a lot of activities that you can do to stay healthy, and this chapter basically covered the things that we can do from an aerobic and an anaerobic conditioning standpoint, like walking, running, cycling, swimming. And so the things that really jumped out early in the chapter had to do with bioenergetics. And your textbook did not label it bioenergetics, but that is what the concept is called. And so if you've had physiology or you take physiology, this is something that either is familiar or you will have a concept of it when you get to physiology. And so there are three things that happen with bioenergetics. And what I want you to understand is that this is a continuum, this process that starts. So if you stood up, you would immediately be using the ATP-PC or phosphocreatine system to stand up to use that energy. And then if you continue to go and move, whether you were walking or running, for the first 30 seconds to 2 minutes, you're going to be in the glycolysis energy system. And then if you continued to move, whether you were walking or running or cycling or whatever you were doing, you would eventually move into oxidative phosphorylation. So that's always a continuum. Now, to kind of give you some idea of how we use this, the ATP-PC system is a very quick energy system, and when it is used, it's typically used in a quick, fast, there's a bear at the door and I gotta go kind of situation. And when we use that, we use fast twitch muscle fibers. Now in Chapter 4, I'll get more into that. The glycolysis system, which if you know the root word glyco, then immediately you start hearing the idea of carbohydrates or glycogen, and so you know that this is a system that's going to need some good energy that has been stored. And so these first two are both anaerobic, which means they really don't operate off of a big oxygen need. And so when we move on and we continue to move, we eventually run into to oxidative phosphorylation. And in oxidative phosphorylation, we've reached the first and only stage, what we can call aerobic. And aerobic literally means with oxygen. And so at this stage, we're going to do something that we're going to need to maintain. We're going to hit a steady state, and we're going to continue that activity for a long time, maybe upwards to several hours, depending on what you're doing. And so this is a system that we usually associate directly with exercise, but it actually works in all forms of activity, from the time that you sit down at your desk and then you decide to get up and then move to the next class. You're working in bioenergetics. The other thing that came out of this chapter was how to assess your cardiorespiratory health, and your book talks about some things like VO2 max, and I want you to be aware of VO2 max, but I want you to be more aware of the fact that to get VO2 max assessed correctly and accurately, you're going to have to go to an exercise physiology lab, and those are not just around every corner like a Walgreens. Those are typically reserved for the biggest universities, regional universities, and then there are some private labs as well. The best indicator for you personally right now is to look at what your resting heart rate is. The best time to do that is in the morning before you even get out of bed. And I know that this is incredibly difficult because it's not the one thing that's on your mind. But if you can assess and find out what your resting heart rate is the moment you wake up, you have a great indicator of what your health is. And if you look at it and you compare it to the variables or the parameters of 60 to 90 being healthy, then that tells you where you sit on a cardiorespiratory health scale. The next thing that you do is you look at your max heart rate. Now this is age variable, so the older I get, the more this changes. And in fact, the more it goes down, because as your age increases, look at the formula, 220 minus my age equals my max heart rate. Now that's the top, that's the very top of my heart rate where I want it to be. What we want to do is we want to say we're going to take a percentage of that max heart rate, and I'll get more into that later. But that is the top, and if we continue to age, then that number will continue to go down. It talks about how to make our goals SMART. And this is a concept, a business model concept. And so if you've had any business classes, you've heard of a SMART goal. And that is that it's specific, that it has a finite name to it, that it is measurable. If you can't make a goal measurable, then I would question if you really even had a goal. Everything should be able to be quantified and measured and given value. The A is for action-oriented, and that means that it requires some type of action on your part. The R and the T, this is realistic and this is time, and these two kind of go together, because a lot of times we make goals and we throw them out there and we say we're going to finish college in 4 years, and sometimes it takes us 6. And so realistically we could have finished in 4, but sometimes life gets in the way and we don't finish until 6. And so these two last parts of our SMART goals kind of really work together. But is your goal realistic? If you watch shows like The Biggest Loser, you'll notice that some people really set lofty goals, and some of those guys and ladies really meet those head on, and that's what we hope for. But a lot of times our goals are a little too lofty. I know a lot of runners who they jump into running, they decide they're going to run a marathon within the first year, and it may be realistic, and they can set it specifically, and they can even measure, and some people can do it. It doesn't mean it's the best idea for them, because a lot of times that causes burnout, it causes injury. It just wasn't the best idea. And that leads me to say this: always consult experts in the field that you're looking at. We talked about that from the second chapter video to now, and I'm going to reiterate it in chapter 4. And then the last thing I want to talk about is our FIT principle, and this is frequency, intensity, type, and time. This principle again comes back in the next chapter as well, but for this chapter, what is our appropriate frequency? If you looked at the book, you saw a graph, and it talked about the FIT principle, and it said moderate activity should really take over most of your time. And if you looked at the intensity, moderate intensity should take up most of your time. And this concept really is the one that you need to focus on. If you do things really hard, really fast, you really run a high risk of injury. There is a concept that I teach in physical therapy as well as in sports medicine that says that you have to take your intensity and you have to take your duration, and you have to focus on those two concepts, or on those two attributes of the FIT principle. Because if your intensity goes up, your duration has to go down. Well, if you looked at what the recommendations are from all of those organizations like the American Heart Association, the American College of Sports Medicine, you saw that duration should be pretty high, which means intensity should be low. That also allows for a greater frequency, which is how many times a week you do it. So keep in mind that if you're doing any type of running, biking, swimming, your intensity should be pretty low. Now, there is a threshold, and I want to talk about that. In intensity, there is a threshold, and we measure this with our heart rate. And what I would do is I would say, I'm 35 years old, I'm going to measure my max heart rate. That means that my max heart rate, 220, minus my age, 35, puts my max heart rate at 185. And so I want to work out in a percentage of that. Your textbook says that most of the week I should work out at about 70 to 75% of that. So that's in the 130, 135 range. So if I wanted to, I could buy myself a heart rate monitor, put it on, go do my run, go do my bike, go do my swim, and I could monitor my heart rate. And as long as I kept it in that 135-ish range, I would be working at a threshold that would continually allow me to make health benefits. If I don't meet that 70% threshold though, I may not benefit much at all. I may do something to maintain, but I may not benefit. And a lot of times when we go out and we do these things and we invest the time, we want to know that we're actually improving. And so to do that, we have to meet the threshold. Another thing on intensity is your perceived rate of exertion. And your perceived rate of exertion is really important. Your textbook gives a scale of 1 to 10. If you looked up Borg's perceived rate of exertion scale, most of the time you would find it listed from 6 to 19. I don't want to go there. I just want to stick on this 1 to 10. What I want you to look at though is it says somewhat hard. That is where we should be all the time. If you looked at the literature enough and you studied it, it would say that somewhat hard is equivocal to the 70% heart rate we should be holding to improve our health anyways. So if you balance those two things out, then you know I should feel like I'm working somewhat hard. That should be about 70% of our max heart rate, and those should be pretty equivocal. Last thing for this video is how long. What is my duration? Well, your book talks about it, and I just kind of mentioned this and led into it, that if you're going to work out really hard, your duration should be lower. It says 20 to 60 minutes, but it says if you go moderate, somewhat hard, or 70% of your max heart rate, then you know what? You can go on up to that hour, 90 minutes, maybe longer, because your body can sustain it. It's all about intensity and duration. The more intensity, the lower the duration. The more duration, the lower the intensity. That'll do for chapter 3, and I look forward to seeing you on the video summary. Let me know what you think. See you soon.